Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Perspectives, where we take a look at current events through the lens of American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is focused on First Buddies, which is a moniker that Elon Musk picked up shortly after the election of Donald Trump. Sort of a ubiquitous presence throughout the interregnum, now with an office in the West Wing, and the question is, have we had something like this before? Well, presidents typically would rely upon their cabinet secretaries as their principal advisors. It's been the tradition over American history, but every once in a while you get other groups of folks as well. Andrew Jackson had his kitchen cabinet, Warren Harding, his so-called Ohio gang, and Dwight Eisenhower had his friends around called the gang, mostly to play bridge and play golf, but also to be there for him and to chat through his presidency as well. But what about these unique individuals, the true intimates that are selflessly devoted to the president, not really looking for a job, just there to help out? Well, in my research on the presidents of the United States, which goes from Washington so far to Eisenhower, I found 4 people that I would put into this category of first buddy. And it was all kind of around the same time, from the 1880s to the 1930s, beginning with Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna was a millionaire by the time he was 40 years old. He's a successful businessman from Cleveland, Ohio, and he liked to dabble in politics. He liked to find fellow Ohioans that he could support, people like Senator John Sherman or the governor of Ohio, Joseph Foraker. But in 1888, at the Republican National Convention, Hanna and Foraker had a bit of a break, and Hanna was looking for somebody different, someone new to kind of support, and he really latched on to William McKinley, the congressman from Canton, Ohio, had been all about the protective tariff, and Hanna really cared for what McKinley brought to the table, even though the two of them were completely different in personality. Hanna, larger than life, he was rough, he was impetuous, whereas McKinley, down to earth, dignified, patient, likable, and really high integrity. And this is part of what attracted Hanna to McKinley, who he supported not only as a congressman, he then supported him to become governor of Ohio, and by the mid-1990s, he's looking to help make McKinley president of the United States. According to Hanna, you are not mistaken in your opinion and standard of McKinley. He's all you believe him to be and as true as steel. Nothing short of a miracle or death will prevent his being the nominee of the party in '96, and to that end I have enlisted. And sure enough, Mark Hanna put his money where his mouth is, helping McKinley get that nomination, building a war chest of $3.5 million, more than twice what McKinley's opponent, William Jennings Bryan, had to spend on the '96 campaign. The '96 campaign was unlike anything in American history. Now, McKinley, he took a traditional route, a front porch personal campaign from his home in Canton, Ohio. But Hanna, very different. He got out, spent that money on really the most sophisticated campaign in American history. There were about 15 million voters in the United States at the time, and Hanna and his team sent out over 200 million pieces of campaign literature, not just flooding the zone, but in a targeted, specific campaign, multiple languages, different constituencies, getting different kinds of mailings, everything they could think of to promote the candidacy of William McKinley. McKinley easily wins that election in 1896, and he knew the first person he wanted to thank was Mark Hanna. Writing a letter, he said, "Before turning to the future, I want to express to you my great debt of gratitude for your generous, lifelong, and devoted services to me. Was there ever such unselfish devotion before? Your unfaltering and increasing friendship through more than 20 years has been to me an encouragement and a source of strength for which I thank you from the bottom of my heart, from William McKinley to Mark Hanna." Now, he wanted Hanna in his cabinet, but it wasn't really what Hanna was looking for. He declined all of those entreaties, but he was interested in supporting McKinley, being in Washington, and so McKinley helped get Hanna an appointment to become a U.S. Senator from Ohio, and he spent a lot of time being McKinley's eyes and ears on the Hill, but also in the White House, smoking cigars, sitting around, talking politics, policy, friendship, whatever it may be. He was there to help out McKinley wherever he needed it. Now, some folks thought it was really Hanna pulling the strings, and he was the senior man in this relationship. Certainly Homer Davenport, the cartoonist of the age, had all kinds of political cartoons portraying Hanna as sort of the power behind the throne. But while Hanna was clearly influential, it was also clear that McKinley was the one who had the final say, and whenever they were in conflict, McKinley would put his foot down and they would move forward with whatever McKinley had to say. One of those came when McKinley was up for re-election. Hanna was now the chair of the Republican National Committee. He's chairing the convention, and one thing he did not want was Theodore Roosevelt as the vice president presidential candidate in 1900 for William McKinley's ticket. Did not want Roosevelt there, but everybody else in the convention was pushing Roosevelt. And so when Hanna was starting to balk a bit there, McKinley wired him from the White House and said, look, whatever the convention wants, that's what we'll go with. Hanna stands down. McKinley and Roosevelt are elected. Hanna is the one in the carriage going with McKinley to the Capitol for his re-election inauguration, and he's also one of the first to race to Buffalo, New York several months later when McKinley is shot. An assassination when McKinley was in the receiving line at the Tower of Music at the World's Fair in Buffalo, New York. Hanna shows up in Buffalo along with the Vice President, Theodore Roosevelt. They confer, and unfortunately they see the passing of William McKinley, which it brings to the end for Mark Hanna, his friendship, his colleague, his buddy, his first buddy relationship is over with the death of William McKinley. We move on to our second example. About a dozen years later, it is Woodrow Wilson, the governor of New Jersey, who is looking to be elevated to President of the United States, and he runs into a man by the name of Colonel Edward Howe. Now, Colonel Howe had no military background. It was sort of an honorary title. He was a bit of a kingmaker in Texas, again, independently wealthy, liked to sponsor some local politicians, and he and Wilson met during the 1912 campaign, and they hit it off perfectly. They bonded over their sort of mutual fondness of growing up in the South during and in the wake of the Civil War. They were also both very much attracted to the British parliamentary system of government, but more than anything else, they were like-minded when it came to sort of both personality and to politics. As far as Wilson was concerned, what I like about Colonel Howe is that he holds things at arm's length objectively. He seems to be able to penetrate a proposition and get to its very essence quickly. He wants nothing for himself. He will not hold office, is a truly disinterested friend, the most valuable possession a man could have, and a common characteristic of these first buddies, that selfless devotion. Now, Wilson wins the election. He wants to have Howe in the cabinet. Howe says, no, I'm not interested in that. I want to help. Why don't I just be a freelancer? I'll go wherever you want and frankly do whatever you want. I don't want a job. I don't want money. And sure enough, that's the first buddy relationship that Wilson and Howe had. And as far as everyone else knew, they knew that Colonel Howe spoke for Woodrow Wilson. Wilson said, Mr. Howe is my second personality. He's my independent self. If I were in his place, I would do just as he suggested. If anyone thinks he is reflecting my opinion by whatever action he takes, they are welcome to the conclusion. And pretty much everybody knew it. The alter ego for Woodrow Wilson for the first 6 years of his presidency was Colonel Edward Howe. Now, a lot of that took place overseas. When World War I begins, the United States remains neutral, but Colonel Howe is there to figure out, eyes and ears on the ground in Europe, what's going on. And because he has the immediate back channel to the president, the leaders in Europe, both sides of the divide in World War I were frankly happy to meet with Howe, trying to influence the Americans' thinking. When the Americans finally get into the war, Howe continues to sort of be that liaison over in Europe, but he finally takes an official position in the administration after the war. When Wilson decides to represent the United States himself at the peace negotiations in Paris, he puts together the 5-member commission, and he actually names Howe to one of those roles. And for the first part of the peace conference, Howe is actually very helpful. But Wilson has to come back to the United States halfway through this conference. Congress came to an end. He had to go back and either sign some bills or veto some bills. He's going to be away for a couple of weeks. Howe is sort of unofficially left in charge. And by the time Wilson gets back, he's angry because he believes Howe has given in, compromised on some of the things that Wilson just was not going to compromise on. He's also pretty annoyed because Howe's name is getting into the newspapers, and that's one of the things that first buddies is kind of a no-no. So Wilson sort of comes back in, he pushes Howe off to the side, he renegotiates things in terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and at the end of the conference, he basically bids goodbye to Colonel Howe, and their relationship is over. They never see each other or speak to each other ever again. Now, this was not the first or the last time that Woodrow Wilson would cut out an intimate who maybe sort of he perceived as crossing that line from what is acceptable for a first buddy and not, and basically ended the relationship. And that's what happened here at the end of the Paris Peace Conference. But for 6 years, a first buddy who had more influence on activities in the United States than anybody else in the country other than the president, Well, that was Colonel Edward House as the second example of our first buddies. Let's move on to another one now into the 1920s and Calvin Coolidge, the president who took over for Warren Harding when he died in 1923. But the relationship that he had with his buddy Frank Stearns goes back to around 1912. Stearns is another successful, wealthy businessman from Boston. He's got family money. He's an Amherst alum like Calvin Coolidge. And at one point, he actually asked Coolidge, who's the president of the state Senate at the time in Massachusetts, for a bit of a favor, actually to help out Amherst. And Coolidge actually says no, and he's kind of abrupt about it, and Stearns wasn't very pleased. But turns out that it was basically bad timing. And with Stearns not even knowing it, a few months later, Coolidge actually came through and delivered on the thing that Stearns wanted, and all of a sudden Stearns was hooked. He saw in Calvin Coolidge a man who not only could help the people of Massachusetts, but could go all the way to the presidency of the United States. Now, this is not really the background of Frank Stearns, but he started doing everything he could to support Calvin Coolidge. He got him to run for lieutenant governor. He raised the money, pushed that campaign. He started having dinners, writing letters, anything he could do to get Coolidge's name out there, including in the follow election in 1918, the run for governor. Stearns, again, putting his own money, about $6,000 of his own money into that campaign, never asked for anything in return, really truly selfless. As far as Coolidge wrote in his autobiography, "While Mr. Stearns always overestimated me, he nevertheless was a great help to me. He never obtruded or sought any favor for himself or any other person, but his whole effort was always disinterested and entirely devoted to assisting me when I indicated I wished him to do so. It is doubtful if any other public man ever had so valuable and unselfish a friend." The relationship, again, was a bit odd at times because Silent Cal was a little bit different kind of a personality. Sometimes, of course, Coolidge just sort of wanted to be quiet, but he didn't like to be left alone. So what he would do is, both governor and eventually as president, he'd invite Stearns to come over, they'd smoke some cigars, they'd hang out. Sometimes they wouldn't even speak, but it was comforting to Coolidge to have Stearns there. Stearns was happy to do it. Of course, on many other occasions, Stearns was out there very publicly advocating for the candidacy of Calvin Coolidge, whether again it's for lieutenant governor, governor, and eventually vice president. And when he becomes president, Stearns is an ever-presence of comfort for Coolidge, not as much on the policy side as some of these other first buddies, but he was always there to support Coolidge. Sometimes he'd go on vacations with the spouses. He was certainly there to really do as a companion anything that Calvin Coolidge wanted. And when Coolidge finally finishes his presidency after the 1924 election, he wins, which Stearns had helped with. He serves 4 more years. It's time to go by the wayside. And Stearns writes him a note and says ever so simply, "For the association that has existed, I am very grateful. I hope you will not think me lacking in humility if I hug the comfort that it is sufficient to be an excuse for having lived, for having served as the first buddy for Calvin Coolidge." Our final example, Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt first engaged with Louis Howe in 1912. He was running for re-election to the state Senate in New York, and he gets sick. He gets typhoid and needs someone else basically to go run the campaign. Now, Howe, a curmudgeonly, testy, chain-smoking political junkie, was in and around the Albany area at the time, writing as a newspaper reporter. And Roosevelt hires him for $50 a week to run the campaign, and he does it with gusto. A great publicity blitz, again, kind of wanted nothing for himself. He starts pushing the advocacy of Franklin Roosevelt. They win that campaign, but shortly thereafter, Roosevelt actually comes to Washington, D.C. in the Wilson administration to serve as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he brings Louis Howe with him as his top aide. Basically, get twice as much done because Louis Howe became his alter ego, completely trusted his instincts to make decisions. Louis Howe, again, stood out for a variety of reasons, but he was very impressive to the people around Roosevelt at the time, including the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, who described Howe as one of the strangest men I've ever met and one of the smartest. Admiral Emory Lloyd put it this way: Louis Howe was a damn smart, able man and the best advisor Roosevelt ever had because he had the guts to say no, and not many people did that to Franklin Roosevelt. Well, Howe was alongside when Roosevelt tried to get back into politics, running for vice president in 1920. He did not win that campaign. And it was the following year, the most tragic year in the life of Franklin Roosevelt, when he gets sick. He gets sick with polio. He's at his family retreat at Campobello off the coast of Maine. Louis Howe is there along with the family, and all of a sudden, high fever. Roosevelt loses the use of his limbs, both his legs and arms at the time. And the person who was there to help him through it, there were really two: Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, and Louis Howe. They took care of Roosevelt round the clock. They clothed him, they fed him, they bathed him, and they tried to do everything they could to keep his spirits up, thinking about the future. Now, Howe also tried to keep the news out of the press. Eventually, it did become public. When they moved back to New York, Howe moved in, continuing to do whatever he could to support Roosevelt. And eventually, when Roosevelt's ready to get back to work, he's coming to grips with the polio, trying to find sort of new ways of walking with braces and holding on to other folks. Howe was there to ease him back into his legal career and eventually into his political career as well. When he runs for governor, he wins. Howe is there alongside. Same thing in 1932 when it comes time to run for the presidency. Louis Howe, again, is his top political advisor. You had people like Ray Moley and the Brain Trust that were really interested in the policy things, but in terms of the campaign, behind the scenes, that was all Louis Howe. They win in 1932, and Howe, by this point, the chain-smoking man, is actually quite ill. He wants a job. He wants to help Franklin Roosevelt still, and they decide to give him the responsibilities of being Roosevelt's secretary, similar to what we would call chief of staff today. He's confined to his bedroom, though, because he is, again, quite ill, but Roosevelt's confident in him. He says, look, Louis can do that job and still work behind the scenes, being the mysterious figure that he loves, and a figure that he loves to help Franklin Roosevelt. He does this for a few years. By 1936, his illness is really taking over. They move Louis Howe to Bethesda Naval Hospital. They put in a phone line with a direct connection to Roosevelt so he could still sort of be there for him. Roosevelt and Eleanor would certainly visit Howe on occasion, but eventually Louis Howe passes away in April of 1936 before the re-election campaign. And this was something that Franklin Roosevelt really did not replace for a long time, according to Eleanor. She said years later, for one reason or another, no one quite filled the void. There are not many men in this world whose personal ambition is to accomplish things for someone else. It was some time before a friendship with Harry Hopkins again brought Franklin some of the satisfaction he had known with Louis Howe. Many aides to Franklin Roosevelt, but really only one first buddy, and that was Louis Howe, in part because all four of these men had something in common. They had many differences as well. In common, the selfless devotion to the principle, to the man, the President of the United States. They weren't in it for themselves. And in fact, when it was perceived that in the case of Colonel House, it maybe crossed that line, the first buddy thing came to an end. And that's sort of the cautionary note here. Because one of the things these four always remembered, who was number one? Who was the boss? What were they there for? When that starts to erode, first buddy syndrome kind of goes by the wayside. That is a look at some of the first buddies in presidential history. For more on these folks, you can check out some of the links in the description for some of the videos from Presidential Chronicles on these relationships. You can also check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Perspectives from Presidential Chronicles.